everyone. Thanks for inviting us to this workshop. It's so much fun actually as a scholar to be here in this more varied context and interact with the other stakeholders. It's very rewarding, so thank you. But now we're going to present the results of a paper that we recently published, and also some brand new data in the end. So the paper is called The Impact of Psychological and Social Factors on Productive Collocation Knowledge in French Long-Term Residents in Sweden, focus on target language engagement. So I guess you already recognize some of the terms here. Elke Peters talked about collocations as well. I think even Miss, you have mentioned collocations, and target language engagement. We've been talking about that as well, obviously. I'm trying to move forward here. Okay. So the paper that we're going to present on French long-term residents in Sweden is part of a bigger project that we've been conducting over the last years called Global Mobility and Adult Second Language Acquisition, the importance of social and psychological factors. And you see two images here. You have Stockholm, where we study French people living in Stockholm, long-term residents. And then we also have Paris, so studying Swedes who've been living for a long time in Paris. So it's a sort of mirrored project. So one can see that the overarching research question for the project is, what factors predict how well you can learn an additional language as an adult? So basically, one of the main questions in second language acquisition, right? And the sort of theoretical rationale is that research suggests an increased importance of social and psychological factors beyond the enrollment period. And it has also been stated that we need some kind of multifactorial approach to investigate this, because many studies, when investigating these social and psychological factors, they tend to focus on one, say, language aptitude or motivation, but a multifactorial, which is needed. But what constitutes a good measure for second language proficiency if you want to try to see how well people can learn? We would say collocations. This is a field that we've been working in for a long time. And they are conventionalized word combinations which refer to a meaning unit and have in common that they cannot be generated by lexical or grammatical rules. And they contribute to fluent and idiomatic language. So we have examples in English, such as make a decision, throw a party, and in our Swedish, the second language, spela roll, ställa frågor. And it has been found, and I think Elke already mentioned it, that collocations are notoriously difficult, even for advanced second language learners. This is a pretty established fact in second language acquisition. And the difficulty in acquiring collocations in an aptitude is assumed to relate to the relative lack of exposure to the target language in comparison with the L1 speaker, and also to the phenomenon of L1 entrenchment. That is, that preferred word combinations in your first language tend to sort of spill over to your. And what do we know thus far about collocations and individual factors from earlier research? Well, not that much, but there is a study from Gavaniana and Long which showed that language aptitude was a significant predictor for lexis and collocations. And they used an aptitude test called the Llama aptitude test, which we have also used, and Clara will describe it. and 2 different subtests, the Llama D and the Llama E have the strongest. I also conducted a study a while ago with another colleague and found an important correlation for productive vocational knowledge with language aptitude, but also with some personality dimensions, because we also investigated personality and saw that open-mindedness and cultural empathy led to better vocation learning. So we see that not only aptitude is a relevant predictor of vocation knowledge, but maybe personality or other factors. Sorry. Now this will also be a bit of a repetition. I saw that Elke mentioned the study by Gonzalez Fernandez and Fleet, who also looked at productive Caucasian learners, but with less advanced learners than Granén and Long, and less advanced than ourselves as well. And their study showed that everyday language exposure was the strongest predictor of productive Caucasian knowledge. And it has also been found in a study by Dabrowska in 2015. There they labeled it everyday language use. So if we look at what has been done in the research, it seems like language aptitude and language exposure stand out as important factors. But we have promised a multifactorial approach, right? And we're thinking that we need to go beyond what has already been done. So we want to include other factors as well. So we thought that maybe acculturation could be an interesting factor to include, because we know from smaller studies and also from our own intuition, of course, that Caucasians are important to social integration. It's important for efficient communication, that they also carry some kind of social meaning often. So we thought that that could be interesting to include, and also social networks, because if you use Caucasians, you may also be able to enter into social networks, or maybe it's the fact that you have social networks that allow you to learn Caucasian. We don't know in what way the direction goes. And then personality, as I had seen before in another study, maybe different personality dimensions make you more prone to create opportunities for language learning, for instance, and maybe also more open to new word combinations, that you need some kind of flexibility in order to accept that, okay, it's make a decision in English, okay, I just have to accept that. You can't say it like I did it in my first language. I just sort of have to go with the other patterns. So we thought that, okay, Caucasians, they are typically native life, and they could be a means for and result of social integration. So finally, the research question for the study, 10%, is, to what extent do the following factors predict productive Caucasian knowledge? And in this case, it's in Swedish as a second language, but we've done exactly the same thing for French as a second language. So we have language aptitude, acculturation, multicultural effectiveness, which is our personality, and I mentioned a personality test, social networks, and reported target language use. So those are our main factors. But then we decided to also include as control variables, length of residence and lengths of Swedish studies, because we imagine that these could have an effect even if they weren't our sort of focus factors. And the hypothesis is that based on previous research, productive Caucasian knowledge will be related to language aptitude and language use. So you basically want to say, you have to have maybe some kind of aptitude for learning, but you also need to be exposed. And the remaining variables are exploratory and no hypotheses are proposed. Now I will leave this microphone for Clara, who will explain the method in more detail. So maybe you want to switch it.
Okay, so now we will describe the instruments that we use to assess the dependent and then the independent variables. So in order to test collocation knowledge, we used a productive collocation test that was recently developed in L2 Swedish, which contains 39 test items. And this test targets verb-noun collocations. And I give you a couple of examples in Swedish. We have föda barn, give birth in English, and ställa en fråga, pose a question. With respect to the psychological variables, we start with the aptitude test, and we use the Llama aptitude test, it is called. And this one taps into vocabulary learning, sound recognition, sound symbol correspondence, and grammatical inferencing. So those are components of what we call language learning aptitude. We then use the Vancouver Index of Acculturation to measure identification with heritage and host cultures. So in our case, identification with the Swedish and French culture, respectively. We also use the multicultural personality questionnaire, which is based on the 5-factor personality model. And this measures personality along the following 5 dimensions: social initiative, flexibility, cultural empathy, open-mindedness, and emotional stability. With respect to the more social variables, we use the social network questionnaire, which yields rich information regarding the participants' social networks. In this study, we're focusing on the number of relationships that the participants maintained in Swedish L2. In the target language engagement questionnaire, the participants report how frequently they use Swedish, so Swedish as a second language, for 23 different purposes. And for the analysis of this study, we calculated an average score for frequency of target language use based on these 23 items or activities. Finally, we also included a sociobiographic questionnaire to obtain information regarding age, occupation, length of residence, and length of Swedish studies. So the initial sample consisted of 64 French and 1 Swedish L2 speakers. We had to exclude a few of these due to missing values. So the final sample consisted of 59 participants, which 35 were women and 24 were men. And the mean age was just over 41 years. And the mean length of residence in Sweden was just over 13 years. Okay, so the participants shared the following characteristics, which were also the criteria for participation. They all had French as their main first language. They had finished upper secondary education, so it's a relatively well or highly educated sample. They had started learning the Swedish language no earlier than 12 years of age, and they had all spent at least 5 years in Sweden. And we recruited participants for the project through the snowballing method and the convenience sampling method. So we posted ads in different Facebook groups, such as Les Français à Stockholm and FrenchConnections.com. And Fanny and I met with each of the participants individually, and during the data collection session, the participants took the tests and filled out all the questionnaires. And this took about 1.5 to 2 hours per session. And to respond to the research question, we conducted 2 multiple linear regression analyses. And in the first model that we will present, we included all of the independent variables, whereas in the second model, we only included those variables that turned out to be important in model 1. And as you will see when we report the findings, we focus on effect sizes rather than on p-values. And now Fanny will tell you about the results.
Okay. Yeah, we're okay.
Okay, good. Okay, so I will just go through this very quickly. This is the first model where we can see that there were 5 different factors that seem to have a stronger effect than the other ones. And those were 2 language aptitude components, so Lama D and Lama E. Lama D stands for sound recognition, so it's some kind of phonetic memory that you can actually remember sound sequences that you hear. And this is a test that has been shown to be a good predictor in other studies as well. So it really seems that there's something going on with this test, Lama D, when it comes to language learning. Lama E has also been important in other studies. It's the sound symbol correspondence. The fact that you can relate a sound to a letter, that is what that measures. And then language engagement, MDQ, open-mindedness, and length of residence. And we ran this in another model with only these ones that were important. And this model actually explained 63% of the variance. And we know from the field in general that if you do a study in individual differences and you have an R square of 63%, it's quite a strong effect. So it seems that this model explains quite a lot of how people vary in how well they master productive collocation knowledge. And the beta values suggest that length of residence, language engagement, and Lama E have the strongest effects among all the variables. And length of residence wasn't in our among our focus variables, but it turned out to be important. But it could also be, of course, related to language engagement. If you have lived for a long time in a country, you have also probably, not always, but there are more chances that you have engaged more. The results confirms the initial hypothesis that language aptitude and language engagement will be important. And it lends strong support to the importance of frequency effects in language acquisition, as advocated by proponents of usage-based theories over the last couple of decades. But it also shows that a psychological or cognitive factor, we could call it, such as language aptitude, is important. This does not mean, of course, that you cannot learn without high levels of language aptitude. It's just that it makes the learning quicker, and also it gives a higher result in the end. What's interesting also is that length of studies didn't really have any importance in this sample, and that might be related to the fact that the learners in this group, or learners, second language users, were quite homogeneous in how long they had studied Swedish. It was often not for very long. It was often about a year. So they had been going to as Swedish for immigrants, SFI, or they had been taking courses for, like maybe 6 months or a year. But most of them had really learned Swedish informally. That is how they can learn Swedish, or not learn, because the thing is that in this sample, you have a lot of variation. You can have people that live 10 years in Sweden or French, and basically don't speak Swedish. They interact in English. We've heard about this phenomenon here today as well. And then you can have people who lived 5 years and who are basically native-like or near native in Swedish. So you have a huge variation. Since the focus of this day is on informal language engagement, I thought that we would focus a bit more on what kind of engagement these learners are doing. So Claire will tell you a bit more about our brand new results here.
Right, so as Patty said, we did observe an effect for frequency of language engagement on L2 proficiency as measured by the collocation test. And of course, that made us curious to know, how do successful so-called language learners use the target language? So what kind of activities do they engage in Swedish that seems to promote their language learning? So to investigate what kind of target language use was the most beneficial to L2 proficiency, Our colleague Marta conducted a factor analysis based on the 23 different activities that were included in the target language engagement questionnaire. And this was followed by a structural equation model. And this analysis showed that the factor that had the largest effect on collocation knowledge, so on language proficiency, included the following target language activities: browsing the internet, using social networking sites online, emailing, text messaging, short and long phone conversations, working in Swedish, small talking, and having long casual conversations. And the results suggest that an increase of 1 standard deviation in frequency of language use for the above mentioned purposes. So if we increase by 1 step in the scale that ranges from 0 to 5, this equals an increase in productive collocation knowledge by 8.6 points. And considering that the test has a maximum score of 39, this can be considered a relatively strong effect. And so we're going to finish off by this brief conclusion that regards this particular study and this particular sample. But we conclude that a more frequent use of Swedish for work and for social purposes, both digitally and in real life, relates to higher proficiency in M2 Swedish. And we're gonna leave it there. Thank you very much.
So, questions from the audience to our prominent speakers, or from Zoom, for that matter. I had a question. What were the other 20? Like there were 23. So, what were the others?
Yeah. So the thing is that,
Speaking.
yes, so you see that we have some other extramural activities here, like watching TV, listening to music, listening to radio, and we also have more academic activities and reading. Yeah, we have those as well, and then we have reading magazines and books, and we have this factor too, actually. Which was found in the factor analysis that included these academic activities. But they didn't, this factor did have a very small effect compared to the first one with work and having conversations and chatting and all of that. That had a stronger effect. And we were a bit surprised that, where do we have this one? That these didn't have an effect. But if trying to speculate, one can imagine that these people have been living for quite a long time in Sweden. And maybe this is sort of more visible in the beginning if you do this or not, if you watch TV, listen to music. Maybe it's that makes more of a difference during the first 5 years. But these people have been living in Sweden for a long time. And I think from our other studies on this group as well, that what really makes a difference is working in Swedish, because some of these French people, they work in Swedish and others do not. Some it could also be related to what kind of social networks you have, what partner you have, because I think that having conversations, texting, emailing, being on social media, all of those are related to being socially integrated somehow. So I think that is what this first, where do we have it? Yeah, this is like working and living and interacting socially in Swedish. And it seems like this is the path of factors that have the most important effect in this study, with people having lived for 5 years in Sweden, at least. Yes, yeah.
Would you say, so it seemed to me that these are mainly then productive and interactive.
Exactly.
So that is what that is it.
Yeah, it is. I mean, yeah. from a cognitive perspective,
Yeah.
it's interesting that they're actually engaging actively. And I think, I mean, I can only guess, we have to look into this closer, but I think the work component is very important here, of course, that some of them have jobs which require quite advanced skills in Swedish, whereas others do not, and I think that, yeah, that helps a lot, obviously, and that's something we know. Yes, more questions, wonderful.
I was just curious about, maybe I came in late, sort of fixed for you,
Yeah.
but what was the way, how did you investigate these factors? Was that survey based or?
Yes,
Okay, so that makes me curious, what was the question about watching TV and so forth? Because it's interesting that the other presentation we saw with the subtitles, you know, that shows that it has an immense impact. So I'm wondering if there's something about the question and the way the question is asked that doesn't really allow that kind of knowledge about, you know, subtitles versus dubbing or whatever to come out.
well, it was, I mean, like, how often do you watch, and then you could choose between every day, once a week, that kind of response, but I think it's maybe more related to the fact that these people have already lived for a long time in Sweden. Maybe if you're more in a learner situation, maybe these other media makes more of an importance, but we're of course also curious to know how come that this didn't have a stronger effect in this study. Right.
What if you would cap the length of residency to, like, you study to 5 years or something like that? Maybe you come up with a different result.
Yeah, exactly. Now I think we should go for the first 5 years, because of course that's when there are lots of things happening in terms of language learning, and also in terms of how you establish yourself in a new country. If you've already been there for 10 years and haven't learned, I think if you've already been somewhere for 10 years and you haven't really learned that much Swedish in your branch, maybe you won't do that. Probably you establish patterns during the first years, I can imagine.
Then I also know that the first point there, browsing the internet, it includes quite a wide scope of activities, from YouTube, reading newspaper, watching television, to everything. So if I ask my children, do you watch television? No, they don't. So,
and also, I mean, using social networking sites, that sounds a bit old fashioned too. I think that, I mean, yeah, on social media, you also watch movies, or you see YouTube clips and you see different reels and stuff like that. So I think that maybe we need to update the terminology a bit in our questionnaire.
very good. So thank you very much for your presentation, and we are now moving